Paul Levinson, and welcome to Light On, Light Through, episode 406. My conversation with David Browne about his book, Talkin Greenwich Village. Well, David Browne is a very popular writer at Rolling Stone. He's written a whole bunch of books about the history of music in the second half of the 20th century. And I have to say, his Talkin Greenwich Village is really a tour de force, absolutely a wonderful book, chock full of fascinating details. So we talked a couple of days ago, and here's our conversation.
The Light on Light Through podcast.
Absolutely.
All right. All right. Well, David, thanks so much for joining me for this interview. As you know, I really enjoy talking Greenwich Village. It kept me up at night, and that's actually a good thing when it comes to books. So why don't we start by you telling us, how did you get so almost obsessed with Greenwich Village that you devoted so much attention, which resulted in this 400 plus page book?
Sure. Well, first of all, Paul, I just want to say thanks for having me on. And it's also a thrill to talk to someone who was there at the time. Who I've talked to a few other people who played in Washington Square Park, but you joined the list, and I feel like I want to interview you. But we'll do that. We can do that later.
Yeah. Well, you can ask me any questions you want.
Well, I guess my obsession started in a way when I came here to the city to start my freshman year at NYU, way back in the day in the late 70s. And, I picked NYU because I wanted to study journalism and they had a program. And I thought, well, I'll give it a shot. And also because it was in the village. And I was coming from northern New Jersey. I could literally see New York from our back window or the sky, a little bit of the skyline. And the village had always been, and like you probably felt the same. It still had this allure to it, even though this was a period, the late 70s, when we were being told over and over again that New York City was in trouble and on decline, and there wasn't any good music coming out of the village anymore, and Dylan was long gone, and on and on and on. But it still had that powerful mystique to it. And I'd been in there a couple of times. It would be like record shopping, but I hadn't lived there yet. And so I think it just kind of started there. And I started going to clubs to see music like almost right away through my years there, and realized even then that there was still a very viable music scene. Even though the media was sort of barely covering it, but the bottom line had opened a couple of years ago, and was attracting big rock stars. But there were still so many clubs on Bleecker Street. You could see these newish talents, like the Roaches or Steve Forbert, or a little couple years later, like Suzanne Vega, or there was Jack Hardy. There were the jazz clubs, the Vanguard was still going strong, and you had a whole new generation of jazz clubs like Seventh Avenue South and Sweet Basil. I mean, it was like this sort of music wonderland to me. I mean, I wasn't thinking, oh, it's over. I thought, well, this is just the next evolution of what was there. So I think it all probably all started there. It all stayed with me.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something about some cities have these like places which are in many ways even more important than the cities themselves. And as you were saying that though, about things were much worse at the time, you were going to into the village, and things were better in the past. I do have to say that all my life I've been hearing that about everything. It doesn't matter what time it is. Whoever you talk to, if you had been here 10 years ago, or
Right, right,
15
right,
years ago, or 5 years ago, that was a million times better.
right,
So
right.
I guess the good news about that is people will be saying that about 2025 in a few
Exactly.
years.
And you were in the city right around just then too, right? The mid 70s, late 70s. I think we were both almost crossed paths at NYU. And did you have that same sense of the music scene then?
I did, but it's a very interesting thing. Everyone takes their own path, as you know, and of the many things that I did in music and still do in music, performing live anywhere just never was one of the main things. It wasn't at the top of the list. And there, as a matter of fact, I would say my favorite performance was up in the Bronx at a YMCA on the Grand Concourse with an a cappella group. And this would have, if it was a cappella, it was probably 1961, 1962, the very tail end of any a cappella in any, the sort of doo-wop harmony sound. And for whatever reason, it just was too much effort to go any place and do something to either get booked in a club or sing, on the outside. But as I did tell you, we did in one of my later groups, the New Outlook. One day we were singing in Central Park, and Ellie Greenwich and her then partner Mike Rashkow walked by, heard us singing, and they signed us to Atlantic Records. So we
Wow.
did get something good from that. But one of the things, of course, that you talk about in your book are the amazing number of iconic people who either got their start completely in the village, or if they got their start someplace else, they made it in the village. And yet I find it very interesting that in Talkin Greenwich Village, the people you most talk about never really broke out and became as important as Dylan. So,
Right.
what attracted you to Dave Van Ronk, other than the fact that you both have the same first name?
That was the main reason. No, I'm kidding. When I started thinking about the book, I think I just like brainstormed a ton of names of people, especially people who were still with us, who I wanted to reach out to. And Dave had passed away a long time ago, so but he was still someone in the back of my mind I knew I had to chronicle him because I knew enough of his story. I knew that he had come to the village in the late 50s from Queens, and he basically never left, unlike everybody else. He was there throughout the 60s into the 70s, and and passed away, when he was still living in the Sheridan Square area. So I knew he was going to have to be a character in the book in some form or another. I wasn't sure to what extent. But in his case, first of all, the more I talked to people, the more I heard stories about their interactions with him, how when they would come to the village, they would take guitar lessons with him. They'd see him singing in Washington Square Park. Someone like Janice Ian met him on the circuit, and he would invite her. He was just a teenager over to he and his wife Terry's apartment, and he'd give her, advice on the music business. And so he really was, he was called the mayor of McDougal Street, and he really did live up to that. And I thought like his story I thought to weave his story throughout the book would be a good foundation for it, because you can sort of see the different eras of the village reflected in him. The early scene, he got there, there wasn't much of anything. He was there when the coffee houses started bubbling up. He was there when Dylan arrived. He was there when the folk scare, as they call it, happened, and there were even more coffee houses. He was there when everything went electric, and he had a short-lived band. He was there in the 70s when the scene was in kind of a funk, and his career was not doing so well. And he was there in the late 70s and early 80s, as now an elder statesman, as a mentor to all these people, whether it was the Roaches or even earlier, people like Danny Calvin, the Blues Project, and certainly Dylan. So I felt like, I didn't want the book to be just a list of clubs that opened and closed. I wanted to humanize the story. So I felt like focusing on people like him, and then the people who were connected to him, like the Blues Project and then the Roaches, would be a good way to look at different eras through these people, and all with Van Ronk, weaving his way through it. And also,
Yeah, and
I'm sorry, I'll also add one important thing is that I think the thing about Dave too is that he embodied he embodied certain things about the village. He was called a folk singer, but he hated that. He loved jazz, and he loved blues, and a little bit of rock. So he sang all that. He loved Kurt Weill. He just loved everything. But also he had a certain kind of uncompromising integrity to him. I'm sure he wanted to sell records like everybody, but he would only kind of go so far to do that. He wanted to keep his own sense of self and his own identity. And I think that is a trademark of a lot of the Village people, which may have prevented some of them from having that success you mentioned, but having that integrity was really, yeah, important.
That's actually what I wanted to ask you. So he obviously is a very talented guy and has a lot of intelligence in addition to that talent. And you gave at least one example, what he was going to record or had made an early recording of Joni Mitchell's Both Sides Now, but before that was released, Judy Collins' version is released and it becomes a huge hit
Right,
record.
right, right.
So, I've always been fascinated by fame and what it takes to make people famous. In fact, I always ask my students, if you had to rank these three things, which would you most want to pursue in your professional life? Money, power, or fame? Now, some people get all three. So if you're president of the United States, for better or worse, you get all three, wrapped up in that one thing. Everyone knows who you are. You have an enormous amount of power, and you usually do have plenty of money. Maybe back in the 1800s, there were poor presidents like Abraham Lincoln, but that's no longer the case. So, obviously, Van Ronk wanted fame. So, why, in your opinion, didn't he make it? Was it just bad luck? Was it maybe he just didn't have enough of a cutting edge? Was it that his talent wasn't quite in the right time and the right place
Right.
to break through?
Well, I think part of it was, in some degree, maybe the sound of his voice. He had a sort of a bark and a bite to his voice. It was pretty rough. He could have a sweet tone too, like when he did Both Sides Now. He kind of softened his tone a bit, but it wasn't exactly, Dave Van Ronk wasn't exactly easy listening compared to, Peter Paul and Mary or Judy Collins or any of these other people who kind of came out of the scene and had success. So I think in some ways that might have been a detriment, and he didn't he kind of played that up live and a lot of his records. Um, but yeah, I don't think, again, like, and he made this one attempt. He formed a band called the Hudson Dusters in '67. That's the band that he recorded Both Sides Now with. Um, he used he used money that he made when Peter Paul and Mary covered one of his songs, so he kind of paid for it himself. But it wasn't, it wasn't kind of a big hit at all. And I think it was in a way kind of a half-hearted attempt to kind of jump on the bandwagon, and maybe he was just like kind of, even though he spoke fondly of the record later, it really wasn't him. I think he wasn't a band guy, the way that Dylan could be. And I don't mean band literally the band, but just a guy with a bunch of backup musicians. I think that kind of prevented him, and I think his but it's funny. I did hear from someone who knew him though that, and it's in the book that, he supposedly was the first person who heard and wanted to cover The Gambler, the song that Kenny Rogers,
Yep.
covered and became one of his signature tunes, and Van Ronk heard it somewhere. It was written by a country songwriter, so I guess somehow in the pipeline he heard it, and he couldn't convince anyone since the '70s to make a record out of it. And so, you wonder, could that have been a moment for him? I can totally see how that song would speak to him lyrically, of this wizened old guy passing on his knowledge kind of thing. He was really drawn to those kind of songs. But that's a case where, like with Both Sides Now, maybe, but the stars just don't always line up. I think that's part
Yeah.
of
You got to know how to hold them. I
it.
told him it's a great song. Kenny Rogers has a fascinating story, right? Because he basically originally broke into the scene with some kind of psychedelic crazy. I just broke in to see what condition my
Yeah,
condition.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Frankly, I thought that was
And I
around.
and I and he yeah he as a total aside, but when he was in that band, which was called Kenny Rogers' First Edition, they made this like double album concept album about the Old West. the Ballad of Calico, I think it's called. That was even crazier than
Unbelievable.
but
Well, yeah, I mean, I thought that song at the time was one of the worst of the psychedelic songs.
right,
I mean,
right.
even Strawberry Alarm Clock's song, or was that the name of the song or the record? Strawberry Alarm Clock. That's the name of the group,
That was the band. Yeah,
right?
Strawberry. Yes,
And what
yes.
was the name of that hit record?
Incense and Peppermints.
Yes, Incense Peppermint. Da, 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 da. So that
Yeah,
was
yeah. I mean, someone like, Van Ronk was just not gonna do that, and he was, his choice of material on his record still, all throughout pretty much adhered to, an occasional original. He might do a Joni Mitchell song, but he would do all kinds of obscure blues songs and instrumentals sometimes, and he just wasn't. Like I said, I think he really wanted to be himself, and you pay the price for that in the marketplace, unfortunately.
Yeah, so if you had to identify the main reason, obviously, again, it's always luck, being in the right place at the right time, but to some extent, maybe it's the case that to become really famous, to break through to that higher level, you have to be utterly devoted to that. And if there's anything else that you're also interested in doing. And you can't just continuously be plugging away for that extreme level of fame,
Right,
then
right,
you have a lesser chance of making it.
right. There's a little, I think, revealing story in the book where about Dylan and how he came here in January of 1961. 64. Am I doing the right math? 64 years ago. This month.
Don't ask me.
And yeah, he was here for a bit, and he made a quick trip back to the Midwest to see some friends and stuff. And one of them who I talked to said, "Yeah, Bob came back, and he's like, he was raving about the village. He was going to go back, and he's like, I'm going to be bigger than Elvis." And this friend of his was just like, "What are you talking about?" I mean, Dylan was barely 20, not even quite 20 yet. And here he is saying, you could tell like he was, he had a goal. And I don't know how many other, I don't know if Van Ronk or others ever said anything like that. It may have been just incredibly unobtainable to them, unimaginable to most of them. But you have to have that focus. You have to have that drive to have that kind of fame and success.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. And let's talk a little bit about Phil Ochs, who you and I have corresponded about him. So
Yeah.
you already know my wife and I loved his music, and back in the day. So you're talking about 64, 65,
Oh.
66.
Did you ever
Uh,
see him live?
oh yeah, my
Oh,
wife and I
wow.
saw him live 5 or 6 times, including his infamous or famous, depending upon what you think of it, Carnegie Hall concert.
Oh, wow.
So,
Wow, I didn't know that.
yeah.
That's
And
amazing.
yeah, we were really devoted to Phil Oaks, and
Okay, this is geeky stuff. Were you at
yeah,
the early show or the late show when he played Carnegie Hall?
I think it
A
was
long time ago, so you might not
no,
remember.
no, I think it was the Late Show.
Okay, okay.
He was booed, I think, at both shows. I mean,
Right.
yeah, I mean, just even talking about that, we loved it. We thought it was great. We understood what he was doing.
And so he was booed like as soon as he came out with as soon as he had the suit on the whole show,
Yeah,
and he booed when he would sing the old rock and roll songs and
yes,
not. Yeah.
yes. I look, it's the same thing today. If you are known for anything, and you're doing anything in public and you don't do what you're known for, the people who come to see you get disappointed. So if I'm invited somewhere to give a talk about one of my nonfiction books, whatever that might be, like for example, I wrote a book on the cell phone and it was published in 2005, and over the years I've been invited to talk about that. And I came up and that's what they expected me to talk about. And instead, I started talking about my science fiction, alternate reality, time travel. I'd probably get booed on that too, although they might be a little more polite, but they certainly wouldn't be happy, the people in the audience. So, you
Well,
know,
let me just add too that it's funny you mentioned that because that was an early uh the album Gunfight at Carnegie Hall that was recorded that night. was one of my early kind of intros to village music. It was a few months before I came to New York. It was the anniversary of Phil's death, and it would have been April of that year. And whoever was on WNEW FM, I don't know which, it might have been Vin Scelsa for those who remember all the old DJs.
Mhm.
Whoever was commemorated his passing by playing that whole album start to finish, all straight through. And back then, that record, it was an import, Canadian import. You couldn't get it anywhere. It was this, I don't even know if I'd even heard of it. But he played it all the way through. He kind of set it up and said it what it was. And I'm just like, I'd never heard a note of Phil Ochs' music before. I'd heard his name sort of, but he was not on the radio when I was a kid. And I was just entranced by this whole thing. I mean, the way that he's doing his old acoustic material and people are cheering, and suddenly there's a band behind him. You're hearing booing, and but then they'll do these beautiful songs with him, like "Pleasures of the Harbor," and people like that. And then he'll do the Elvis or Buddy Holly, and you hear like people yelling at him, and I'm like, wow, this guy, not only did he go through this, he put it on a record and put it out.
Yeah.
I thought,
Well,
if there's a village person I want to know more about. That's an incredible. People normally, if that happens, they want to put that in the closet somewhere, And he was like, no, I'm going to release this as a record.
absolutely. And I think on one of his albums, I don't remember which one it was, but he actually put, where the praise blurbs would usually be, all the negative things that people were saying about him. But he wasn't crazy when it came to that. That's actually a good publicity move too, because if you, I actually try to talk one of my publishers once. Somebody once said that one of my novels is like the worst novel they ever read. So I seriously, my publisher then was Tor. I said, put that, on the back cover. It'll attract, people. I just couldn't sell them on that. So, I, you know, so, but Phil Oakes, ironically, he did have an excellent publicity sense, and that's I think why he did get as far as he got, and of course, one of the tragic things, as you talk about in your book, he had severe psychological problems, what back then was called, bipolar, whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and it was just a really, tragic ending to his life. And for me, I wrote a novel, about in which John Lennon wasn't assassinated, but really the first time someone that I really, really loved who wasn't assassinated but died way, way too young was what happened to Phil Oakes. I was a kid when Buddy Holly was killed, and I was upset about that because I liked his music, but I was, about 5 years too young to really fully appreciate it. As a matter of fact, one of the things which I'll mention to you and to sort of tease our viewers and listeners, literally a couple of weeks after Phil Oakes took his life. Back then, I was an assistant professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University in Teaneck, and they had, and probably still have, a college radio station, WFDU-FM. And I basically had talked them into, why don't you start a show called Seminar on the Air? And like, just, not even every week, once a month, I'll come with my class and I'll conduct the class on, your radio station. And I thought that was a great idea. So I've been doing that for a couple of months, and then Phil Oakes died. And I realized I wanted to do a show about Phil Oakes. So I told the program director about it. I won't mention his name to you, but this will give you and everyone an idea of what kind of person I am. I said, look, I want to do a show on Phil Oakes. We're going to play some records. I'm going to invite a friend of mine, Josh Meyerowitz is his name. He's written a couple of books. He was in the same PhD class as I was, and he was a Phil Oakes fan. And we'll play some Phil Oakes records and talk about it. And he said, okay, but look, Seminar on the Air, your classes run about an hour, so we can extend this to like 2 hours, but please no more than that. Okay,
Okay.
so we go in, and we're playing Phil Oakes music, and we're both so upset, And, we look at the clock when we're pretty much finished saying what we want to say and playing what we wanted to play, that it's 3 hours. So I
Wow.
call the program director and say, hey, listen, the thing came out great, but it went 3 hours. And I hope you can look, he's a very important person. This is something that history needs to hear. And he said, no, look, I'm serious. You're going to have to go back in there and edit it to 2 hours. So I'm trying to decide what to do. Neither Josh nor I wanted to do it. I knew somebody at the New York Times who was the guy who put in the radio listings. The New York Times used to have listings of what's on radio shows in addition to television shows. And, I sent him a note and my hand slipped when I was writing how long the thing was. And I said, it's going to be on from 9 in the evening, 2, 3 Saturday nights from now till 12 midnight, or 3 hours.
Right.
So then Jesse didn't do anything. And sure enough, the New York Times on that Saturday comes out with the newspaper and they list it for 3 hours. So I call up the program director and said, I don't know what happened. The New York Times made a mistake. I told them it was 2 hours. They listed it 3 hours. What are we going to do? He said, all right, go ahead. It's okay. What can we do? We don't want to disappoint people. I don't want to get into a fight with the New York Times. So we got the whole thing broadcast.
Great.
Anyway, though, to make a long story short, Josh Meyerowitz called me a couple of months ago and said he found the tape recording that he has of that. So
Oh my
sometime
God.
in the next year, we're going to actually release that, and I'm going to put that up on my podcast.
Oh,
And,
that's
and
awesome.
you'll hear what we were saying about Phil Ochs literally a couple of weeks after he died.
Wow.
That was
Wow.
also, Tina and I got married literally, I'll tell the world our anniversary, April 25th, 1976. So that was right around the time also. And so a lot of things were happening back then.
Wow.
But,
Yeah.
what is your view? I mean, you say, a lot about Phil Ochs, but I'd be interested in how you would rank Phil Ochs. Obviously, in terms of his impact, he's nowhere close to Dylan. But I always thought that at his best, Phil Oakes's songs were as good as, in a very different way, as Dylan's best songs. Would you agree with that, or you think that's being a little too favorable to
Um,
Oakes?
I think some of his songs approach that. I think some, I mean, I'm not sure if Dylan ever wrote a song quite as tender as Changes, for example. He's written some sweet songs, Dylan, but nothing quite like that. And I think there was something, you know, Dylan's, political songs, which was kind of a small window when we think about it now, didn't last that long. They tended to be a little elliptical. They weren't about really specific events. And when he did, they could be a little heavy-handed. He was better with the sort of Masters of War when it was, or Hard Rain when it was more allegorical. And I think Phil, had that talent of zeroing in on something a little more specifically and making it and not making it dated. You can still hear Too Many Martyrs or some of those songs, um, and I think they transcend, being just dated protest songs. Um, I think Phil, I think as a singer, he was very distinctive among all those people. He had a kind of strange purity in a way to his voice that was at odds with some of the songs he could sing. It wasn't a biting, cutting Dylan kind of voice. It was a little more melodious, in a way. And I think that might have put people off. But I think people also forget some of those later records of his. I mean, Rehearsals for Retirement, the record he made right after the Democratic Convention in '68 when he was just devastated by that. And it's this really searing record about this depression that he found himself in after that, about the country. Um, and the album after that called Greatest Hits, which was not a greatest hits album, was all these new songs that were more like kind of nostalgic and about Americana, are incredibly overlooked and kind of forgotten records that I think are up there with with some of the Dylan stuff. But again, I think he was, he had those ambitions that Dylan did, but at the same time, he was also someone who would run off to any, rally or yippee event or any civil rights thing that came calling. He was there. He was on a plane or a bus or a car, whatever, to there. And I think that I don't think it hampered it. It might have, maybe it hampered him. It didn't, he always was balancing his sort of civil responsibilities with his career in a way that I think maybe hampered that in a sense, and he wasn't quite he didn't play up the mythic aspect that Bob did. He seemed, from what I hear, he was an intense guy, but somewhat more approachable and loved doing interviews and things like that. And Bob didn't. So
Yeah,
I think, but I think so many of his songs, some of the ones I mentioned, or Draft Dodger Rag, or I Ain't Marching Anymore, or Pleasures of the Harbor. You can go through. Some of them have endured as much as anybody else from that period, if not more. So
absolutely. And again, in terms of like, the Dave, the Dave Ronk story, the bad break is his version of both sides now, which could have been a huge hit record.
right,
Didn't get out there. There's an equivalent Phil Ochs story, true story. His small circle of friends is released. It begins to get airplay on a lot of top 40 stations, and this is just one of the many reasons why I hate the FCC. The FCC had just issued, a warning to radio stations that they might not get their licenses renewed if they broadcast anything that promotes drug abuse. And there's a line in Small Circle of Friends, which is about the apathy. So a woman's being murdered
right,
downstairs, out in the street, and people in an apartment building are looking down. And each of the verses talks about the way the people in apartments are just ignoring that. And there's a line, smoking marijuana is more fun than drinking beer. And so these idiots at radio stations said, "Oh my God, we don't want to get on the FCC's kill list. We're not going to play that
right,
song." And they literally took that out of airplay.
right. You're totally right. And you kind of wonder what would have happened if that song had become a hit, because it has I mean, the arrangement of that with the piano and like um, I think it's a banjo or something. It's almost like a ragtime thing. It's almost borderline novelty arrangement. And you wonder if that had become a hit, would that have been like, a burden, an anvil on it, what do you call it? Just an anchor on him. Like people think, oh, how come your songs like when Melanie does Brand New Key, and everybody thinks that's the Melanie sound, even though it's this little ditty. And so, but would have been nice. It would have been a hit. But you kind of wonder, like, would he have been pegged as some novelty protest singer or something if it had been. So that's your next book, Paul, The Alternate Reality of
Yeah.
Phil Oakes.
Yes. Well, no,
What would
you're
have
right.
happened if Carnegie Hall, if they loved Phil Oakes at that?
That's right.
Become a rock
Yeah.
star.
Yeah. No, this is the fun of alternate reality writing. You can make the stuff up, and as long as it's plausible, grab people's attention.
Right. But
And
Phil is also, I'll just add that Phil is the thing that attracted me to his story in doing this book is like Van Ronk in a way. He sort of paralleled the village. He arrives there in the early '60s, this fresh-faced, kid from Ohio, doing, ingratiates himself into the scene, is with Dylan and Paxton and Eric Anderson and all these people and singing in the Gaslight, and he's there. He gets the record deal like so many of the others do. And yet, as we all know, like you mentioned, he had clearly some psychological issues. And, the Phil that suddenly resurfaced in the village, in the mid 70s was, this shocking apparition to a lot of people. He was calling himself John Train. He was dressed like a slob, untucked tails and dirty. And he was telling everyone Phil Ochs was dead, and he was now that person, and he was sleeping on the streets. He had these weird kind of quasi gangster types as his security guys and things like that. And it was almost like he became this like walking metaphor for what had happened to the village by then, which by then had become overrun with, kind of cheesy stores. Some of the clubs like the Gaslight had closed by then. The village went through a real slump there in the early mid 70s. And Phil was like the weird unintentional embodiment of what then happened. And of course he died just as things were starting to get going again, which is really, that's really kind of the tragedy in a way. If he had just hung in there a little longer, I bet he would have been like a Van Ronk type character on that scene.
Yeah, and I was very interested, as I told you, I didn't know this, that, another unfortunate thing that when Phil was in this somewhat crazed state near the end of his life, he would actually badger Dylan and, say, what you are you going to include me in Rolling Thunder, tour or not, because the sort of legend that's always been the forefront of the Phil Ochs fan base is Phil Ochs wanted to be in the Rolling Thunder Review, and Dylan, out of jealousy or he didn't care enough, just ignored Phil Ochs. And I think that there may have been an element of that in there because Dylan, of course, it was no angel either. No,
Right.
nobody's an angel. But it sounds like Phil contributed that to himself. I mean, just final thing about Phil Ochs, and we'll get on to something else. I can't remember who it was. I mean, maybe it was Leonard Bernstein, but it might have been someone else. Actually talked about the crucifixion on some television show as, the great piece of analysis that it is. And it still very much applies that fans get, unfortunately, it's a pretty horrifying thing to think about, almost as much enjoyment when a figure that's high up there falls as when the figure goes, up the ladder. They almost, at least unconsciously, want to see this figure fall off the ladder. And to this day, I think this is one of the most chilling sociological analyses of the rise and fall of public
Yeah.
figures. Let's
Right.
move on to the Blues Project because I wanted to publicly pester you about not saying a word about Cheryl's going home. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I guess I was a little too dismissive of their third album, the Live at Town Hall album, which was sort of cobbled together from like some live stuff, and they put studio songs like that and stuck applause on them. It was this kind of unfortunate, kind of shoddy finale for a group that had so much promise. So yeah, sorry, Paul. Someone else in another podcast, uh, funny, brought up that same song and said, "I love that song." I mean, mention.
Well,
Yeah, there's only so many pages and so many songs you can jam in there, but but
no,
the Blues Project to me was another group I wanted to focus on. They were the Village's great and now lost kind of rock band, much more than like the Velvet Underground, who were more like East Village. But in the West Village, which was where my book focuses on, all the hopes are on the Blues Project, and I think they also, um, uh, embodied that real crucial period in that neighborhood when a lot of the folk singers, acoustic people started going electric and forming bands. And Danny Kalb, the guitarist, was came out of that folk blues tradition, and Steve Katz, who sang Cheryl's Going Home, the same. And and they just like John Sebastian with Love and Spoonful, Jesse Colin Young with the Youngbloods. These are coffee house guys who decide, wow, the Beatles are in. This folk thing is maybe a little played out. I'm going to form an electric band. And the Blues Project was, kind of part of that wave. They became sort of the house band in a way at the Cafe A Go Go. They had Al Cooper in them, who of course became well known in music business circles anyway at that moment for playing, organ on Like a Rolling Stone, recreated in A Complete Unknown. But they also captured the kind of debate that was going on in that scene at that time of do you sell out and go commercial, or do you stay true to your roots? And Danny Kalb was very much a blues purist. He didn't really write that many songs at all. He just kind of wanted to honor Muddy Waters and Lightning Hopkins and all these people. And Al Cooper in the band also had sort of the opposite. He was not raised on blues at all. He was a pop guy. He was kind of a brill building guy, and he wanted them to have hits. And so there was this whole internal dynamic in that band that eventually, led the group to kind of fall apart, and Cooper leaving first. And I think there was something about that I think like I said, it just embodied what was all the debates and discussions and you know confrontations to some degree that happened in the village. And as the time also in the village is becoming electric and becoming overrun with teenagers and runaways and more drug dealers and everything that the electric bands kind of brought with them. And so, when the Blues Project kind of fall apart and the scene itself starts to deteriorate, it all kind of, you know, uh, kind of matched, all kind of converged at the same time.
Yeah. So Al Cooper, I think, was in the Royal Teens. Was that the name of the group? Bob
Does,
Gaudio's
yes,
group?
yes, and
Yeah.
he wrote or co-wrote "This Diamond Ring," the Gary Lewis and the
Right.
Playboys. One of the first records I really loved as a little kid, actually. Funnily enough, I guess my older sister had the record or something. But yeah, I mean, he was very much a kind of a pop soul R&B guy, and he had greater ambitions. He wanted to bring in a horn section, and Danny Kalb was like, "No, we can barely pay the rent now." And so Cooper ends up leaving and starting Blood, Sweat, and Tears, which has the horn section. So, you know, um, you never know how things end up. But I think they were a group that's at this point in time kind of largely, I think, forgotten. Unless you're of a certain age. And I thought focusing on them, and again, most of the guys in that band took guitar lessons with Van Ronk. They knew him. Danny Kalb was with Van Ronk the night of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they all thought the world was going to explode. And they went to the Gaslight and found out, oh, I guess not. But like he was, part of that scene and part of the Van Ronk world. And so I thought it'd be, I think one of the things I wanted to do was bring some attention to some of the forgotten musicians in the village who were real noteworthy, and that was to me they were a good example of that.
Well, that was one of the best parts of Talking Greenwich Village. I mean, I think seriously, someone could make a movie, a biopic about Dave Van Ronk. Someone could make a biopic about the Blues Project. Someone could make a biopic about the Roach Sisters.
Yeah.
Each of those, you give so much
I'm
rich.
calling Ken Burns right now.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Well, tell them I recommended it for sure. I mean, just getting back though to the Royal Teens, I remember as a kid they had a song "We Love Short Shorts." Remember,
oh yeah, yeah,
we
yeah. Right,
who wears short shorts,
right, 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 yeah.
and of course, Guardiola founded the Four Seasons. By the way, I'm someone who never could stand Blood, Sweat, and Tears. I didn't like them then. I don't like them now. They're okay. Maybe
Right.
it's because I'm not particularly a fan of jazz, although I like dun 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 dun. Isn't that like a jazz song? Midnight in Moscow by someone
Okay,
from
okay.
the 1950s or whatever. By the way, I also don't
But
like.
you don't even like the. Do you like the first Blood, Sweat, and Tears album with Al Cooper, or is it
I
just the later ones?
No, I don't like any
None of
of
it.
Blood. No, because to me it was like it sounded self-indulgent. It
Okay.
sounded to me like a bunch of musicians and singers who were very talented, but rather than just like thoroughly being immersed in this music that they were bringing to us, they were each sort of just like demonstrating their own prowess as musicians. But I don't know. That's just me. It's and by the way, I will say about Cheryl's going home. There's a video I saw on YouTube not that long ago. In fact, it was I think after I read your book, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this to you, a very recent concert that Bob Lind did, maybe just a year or two or three ago.
Wow.
And he actually, for like the last 20 or 30 years, there's another video of him like in 2001, 2002, doing a much better rendition of Cheryl's Going Home with a little band behind him than his original recording. But the reason why I'm mentioning this, he starts off before he starts singing the song complaining about all the terrible versions of the record of the song that have come out. And I forget there's like some lunatic in England or some crazed group that did a version of it. And
Okay. Okay.
he says they were out of his mind. And then somebody from the audience screams out, "What about the Blues Project?" And he says, "Yeah, yeah, the Blues Project too." And so he loves
Like
the,
he didn't like that either, in other words?
no, that's
Yeah.
right.
Wow. Okay.
He was just annoyed that he thought his version, singing it, not, obviously everyone knew he wrote the song, but
Right.
him as a recording artist did not get the attention and adulation that it deserved.
Wow. Wow. Well, he did Butterfly of Love too, right?
That
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 was just, yeah, yeah.
yeah, that was a huge hit,
That
Butterfly.
was a huge hit. And that was one of those really super commercial folk songs that, I mean, no one mentioned that to me when I was doing my book, but yeah, that was that period, like I said, when a lot of those folkies in the village were turning to rock and roll. And I often wondered if it was because of songs like Butterfly of Love. It was just
Yeah,
this
yeah.
kind of syrupy quasi folk song that was a hit single and just,
Yeah, well, to me, I mean, obviously lyrics and music, both are important, but it's somewhat disingenuous to say, well, maybe the lyrics are more important than the music because you really can't separate the two.
right.
But one of the things about Bright Elusive Butterfly of Love is, despite the syrupy music, the lyrics are very good lyrics. It is a poetic love song, and I think it needs to be granted that at least. It's not a great song, but
You made
it's
me want to go listen to it again for the first time in a
yeah,
long time.
yeah. You might wake up one
Up one
morning.
morning,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
that part.
Phil Oakes could have sung that song actually with his tone of voice.
To,
Well,
to, to cap off the Phil Oakes,
yeah.
one thought I'll add to that is, yeah, one of the things, especially as soon as Trump became president the first time, I thought, man, if only Phil were still here, the songs he could have written, like the way he wrote songs about LBJ and Nixon, it's like, lost opportunity.
No, you're completely right. As a matter of fact, a couple of things about that. First of all, Phil Oakes, as I'm sure you know, originally wrote a song, "Here's to the State of Mississippi." So he's
Right,
basically putting down Mississippi and its oppression of
right,
African American people. But when Nixon became president, he just changed up the lyrics to "Here's to the State of Richard
right,
Nixon."
right.
And so there's no doubt that he would have said, "Here's to the state of, MAGA Republicans," or whatever it is that he would have gotten he definitely would have done that. I, was, even fooling around thinking of updating some of his, lyrics to his music at some point, but I decided not to do it because I didn't want to incur
Right,
the wrath of Phil Oakes devotees doing that. But I think there are a couple of people who have done just that. They've taken his songs and updated them to the 21st century.
right, right.
But the problem, of course, with that is they're not as good, lyricists as Phil Oakes was. So
Okay.
although it's fun to sort of hear that in a way, it sounds derivative and it doesn't have the same punch as Phil Oakes's original renditions.
Yeah, something about modern protest songs. They're just every once in a while one of them comes out and not it could be in hip hop, it could be in some not just, a folk tradition, it could be something else. And I don't know. It's like they don't make the impact that they used to. I don't know why.
Yeah.
They
Uh,
just kind of come and go. Maybe it's because there's just too much music out there in the world. Maybe they're just not great songs. I mean, that's the thing about some of those Phil songs or Dylan songs or even something as hokey as Eve of Destruction, which I'm sure you
uh,
remember too.
yeah, yeah,
Everybody like disparaged that as like a
Yeah.
corny commercial protest song, but it had this hooky arrangement, and you remembered it. And I just hope somebody in whatever genre it is, could be Latin hip hop, I don't care, writes a great protest song, that has like a great hook. I think the last one I can really remember was like Sun City, in the mid '80s, the Steve Van Zandt, and all his friends. That was a pretty memorable, melodically memorable song. And I think you kind of need that for protest songs. We just don't seem to have that anymore.
No, I think you're right. Are you familiar with Hegel's Spirit of an Age? You know, the philosopher Hegel. He's
Yeah.
known for his dialectic theory, but one of the things I think that also is impressive in his writings as a philosopher, and this is really not philosophy; it's more history. He actually argued that from time to time, music by Claude Debussy. You have painting, of course, by Monet, Manet, etc., etc. So I think that if Hegel had been alive in the 1960s and 70s, he would have pointed to the protest, Greenwich Village, music, all of that, all of the things that you talk about in Talking Greenwich Village were the spirit of that age. And
Right.
one of the reasons why protest music is so tepid now is because it can't possibly equal that. Because one of the things that you really astutely point out all over your book is how it's not just this artist or that artist, it's artists playing off of each other, being
Yeah.
competitive, being inspired by other artists. I mean, again, even Phil Ochs, even in his bad state, he was so angry about not being included in the Dylan tour that got him to write more songs. I mean, some of his last songs were very powerful songs.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's a real I think one of the things about the village music scene, and this was in the 60s and it even was there in the late 70s and early 80s, is that it was this community, it was a small world, it's less than a square mile, and some of the clubs are across the street from each other. It's not like other music scenes. It was very distinctive in that way. And it also in that way fostered that competitiveness. You could be in these small rooms and clubs with other songwriters, and they'd play you a new song, and you'd play one for them to try to top them. There was this whole songwriters workshop that started in the late 70s at the now defunct Cornelia Street Cafe, where people like Suzanne Vega and some of the Roaches would pop in. There would be a Monday night thing where anybody was welcome, and you could play your new song. It had to be a new song written in the past week. There were these strict rules, and people would critique them right to your face if they wanted. And that resulted in some great songs, and probably some that fell by the wayside. But it's that sort of atmosphere that really was one of the legacies of the village. And it could be in jazz as well, and it could be in rock as well. But you had this. Uh, when I thought it was so revealing, that when Joni Mitchell was in the village, but very briefly. I mean, it was like less than a year in like 1967 before she went. Then she went to Florida, and then she went to California. So, and she was there for a very brief time, and she met Van Ronk and all these people. But she supposedly, in that short period of time, wrote 60 songs, which was the most she'd ever written up to that point in her life. And I think that's such a testament to that atmosphere, that it spurred you on to be creative and to keep topping yourself and top other people, and it was such a fertile atmosphere. I think that's partly what led to so many lasting songs coming out of that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that that's the way it is for most creative people. In my own, writing, just as a writer, between like 1998 and 2006, I literally wrote and had published 10 books, five novels, five media theory analyses, and so on.
Wow.
But talking about numbers of books, let's conclude this by you sharing with us, if you're comfortable doing it, what your next project is. What can we expect next?
I don't have one at the moment, to be honest. I wrapped this one up just really a few months ago, and I have a day job at Rolling Stone that's great and keeps me extremely busy, and I'm working on some great stories there at the moment. And I'm not thinking right away of another book. Hopefully, another one will come to mind, but I think this one was a pretty intense project. It took me 3.5 years or something of and juggling with my job at Rolling Stone. So it was a lot of research involved. So I think I'm just happy to take a little bit of breathing room, and we'll see what comes next.
All right. Well, I'm sure whatever does come next is going to be
Oh
great
well,
because
you're
I
very
think.
very kind.
No, well, listen, I wouldn't say this, just as, some idle form of flattery. I really think that Talking Greenwich Village is a unique masterpiece.
Oh wow.
Anybody who wants to understand what you and I, in very different ways, but slightly overlapping ways, experienced, I can't think of a better guide than David Browne's Talking Greenwich Village.
Oh, thank you.
So,
I really appreciate it, especially from someone who was around then. That means a lot.
well,
And I don't mean that in a bad way. I wish I could have been some of those places you were. I was a little too young for some of them.
Well, yeah, look, everyone always has unique opportunities in whatever time in which they're born, and always, feels bad if they missed an earlier time. I've done a lot of work, nonfiction work, although sometimes it pops up in my fiction on Marshall McLuhan. And his world really came into being when he was in the 1930s at Cambridge University in England. And that was a remarkable world, too, in terms of that, in
Right.
terms of literary people, in terms of studying James Joyce and bouncing off that and so on. So,
Wow.
for anybody who's watching this, don't think that your time has gone by. There's a time that you can be a part of right now. You just have to find it and fit into it. All right, so thanks a lot. And whenever you do get around to writing your next book, I'll have you back and we'll do an interview about that.
I would love that. I would love that.
All right, take care.
Well, great,
Bye-bye.
great talking to you.
The Light on Light Through podcast.
And I hope you enjoyed that interview with David Browne, author of Talkin Greenwich Village. By the way, David will be appearing at Big Red Books on March 6th. Big Red Books is in Nyack, New York. So if you have a chance, by all means, come by and see him. And speaking of Big Red Books, I'll be there on February 23rd at 4:30 p.m. doing a unique reading from my novel, It's Real Life and Alternate History of the Beatles. Unique because joining me in this reading are two people who are actually characters in the novel, Anthony Marinelli and Amanda Greer. In addition to that, Frank Labono will be playing a very important part in the reading, and Denise Reed, who, if you're a fan of FBI, you may remember her part in a very good 2024 episode. That's a great show, by the way, FBI. It's by far my favorite of the three FBI series. Anyway, Denise Reed will be doing an important appearance as well. And I'll be back here soon with another episode of Light On, Light Through. We have some great interviews coming up. In the next couple of weeks, you'll hear my interview with Sarah Seltzer and her great novel, The Singer Sisters, and my interview with Simon Vozick Levinson, who is an editor at Rolling Stone magazine. And of course, I'll also have reviews of some of the great television that's on these days. Wow, it's really yet another golden age of television. I was just watching the first 5 episodes of The Pit last night. That's on HBO Max. This season of Severance, season 2, is even better than the first. That's on Apple TV. That's saying a lot because I thought the first season was great. So we'll have some episodes that are devoted to my reviews of those great shows and other excellent television as well. In the meantime, stay safe, stay sound, and enjoy.
The Light on Light Through podcast.
Athens, 2042 AD. She ripped the paper in half, then ripped the halves, then ripped what was left again into bits and pieces of history that could have been. Sierra Waters had read once that, years ago, it was thought that men made love for the thrill, while women made love for the sense of connection it gave them.
Curled Up with a Good Book says, Sierra Waters is sexy as hell. You can find out more about The Plot to Save Socrates by Paul Levinson at theplot2save.com.
Your brilliant story, it's real life.
Paul Levinson silk code about an ancient biotech war raging on in secret for centuries.
Reading words from Paul Levinson's mind.